All right, you know something about cranial nerves. We're going to look at those a little bit. Every other nerve in your body is called a peripheral nerve. And they all come from the spinal cord. Okay? So they're called spinal nerves. You have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The spinal nerves exit the spinal column through the intervertebral foramen. Okay? So on this model right here, you can walk up to it, and you can see the vertebrae and these little yellow things coming out here. They're made out of the dorsal and the ventral roots coming out of the spinal cord, and they fuse to make a spinal nerve. Now, just lateral of the spinal cord, the spinal nerves are going to branch, and they're going to go off, and they're going to make all your peripheral nerves. So you've heard of some of these: ulnar nerve, radial nerve, sciatic nerve, so on and so forth. These are all of your peripheral nerves, and they all come from these. Okay? So there's 31 pairs. So you got to know something about the vertebrae, right? We've got 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar. When you're naming the spinal nerves, they get named for the vertebrae they're next to. Now listen to this next part. There are 8 cervical spinal nerves, which doesn't make a lot of sense because there are only 7 cervical vertebrae, right? So for the first 7, the nerves come out above the corresponding vertebrae. Okay, so this is C1 vertebrae, that's C1 spinal nerve. And that's true for the first 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So C7 spinal nerve comes out above, superior to the C7 vertebrae. But the 8th spinal nerve is actually the 8th cervical, and it comes out below. So from that point on, everything is below the corresponding vertebrae, not above it. Okay? So for the first 7, they're all above, and then C8 is actually below the 7th cervical vertebrae. Then you get to T1 vertebrae, and T1 spinal nerve is inferior to that. So C7, C8 is where that switches. And if you don't learn that, it's going to confuse the crap out of you. Okay? So 7 cervical vertebrae, first 7 spinal nerves are cervical, and then there's an 8th cervical spinal nerve, but it comes out inferior to C7. After that, it's T1, T2, and all the way down to T12, and then you get 5 lumbar and 5 sacral, and 2 or 3 coccygeal, depending on the structure of the coccyx. So I'm going to want you to learn those as just their pairs, okay? And that's so you can count. There's going to be a question on the exam. One of these is going to be labeled. It's going to say, all right, what is this? Sometimes students tell me that's a peripheral nerve. Nope, these are spinal nerves. They're not peripheral nerves until they split. So at this point, they're spinal nerves, okay? And you can number them 1 through 31 if you want, or you can actually say C1, C3, C4, T1, whatever. I'll take either of those as long as it's right, okay? So that's pretty straightforward, not anything real tricky there. The next thing to learn is how they group, and these are called plexuses. So a plexus is when nerves come out and then they assort fibers. Now you're not going to see that on here, but in places like this guy, no, not on this particular one. That's it. This guy over here. You can see that the spinal nerves come out, but then they start to actually blend fibers. So your peripheral nerves are actually usually made by roots from different levels of the spinal cord. Now the reason for that is to make it redundant. Okay? If you want to have motor control of your hand, it's best if you have nerves mixed from different levels of the spinal cord, so if you have damage to part of that, you still have control of your hand. It's redundancy. Okay? So where those fibers come out and they mix, it's called a plexus. A plexus is where several spinal nerves contribute to multiple peripheral nerves. It's called a plexus. Okay? In your packet, the plexuses are defined, and I do expect you to know the plexuses. Okay? So for instance, the cervical nerves up here, C1 through C5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that makes up the cervical plexus. There are a few peripheral nerves that come from the different plexuses, and so what you should know is you should know what spinal nerves make up each plexus and what important peripheral nerves come from each plexus. Okay? You want to write that down so you know what to study? You got to identify the spinal nerves. You need to know which spinal nerves make up which plexus. And then only the peripheral nerves that I put on your list. And what did I put on there? Maybe not even a dozen, okay? Those peripheral nerves, you need to know what plexus they come out of. Okay? So for instance, C1 through C5 makes up the cervical plexus. There is only one peripheral nerve I want you to know the name of from the cervical plexus, and that's the phrenic nerve, okay? And it comes from C2 and C3. This wire model over here is the peripheral nerve model, and I have on here labeled some stickers that have started the photo bleach, but most of the peripheral nerves are labeled on here. So this is what you'll get asked those questions on. There's the phrenic nerve, labeled right there. The phrenic nerve comes down and innervates your respiratory diaphragm. That's why that's so important, okay? If you get a high cervical lesion to the spinal cord and it's below the level of C2, you don't die because you keep breathing, because you don't sever the phrenic nerve. But if it's above C2, so it's C1 or right at C1, C2 junction, you suffocate because the diaphragm quits working. So those aren't survivable, okay? Okay, so then you come down, C4/C5 through T1 is the brachial plexus. And I say slash because different books will describe it differently. You can go by what's in your packet. Starting at C4 all the way through T1 contain fibers that are in the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus gives rise to 5 major peripheral nerves, okay? And they are the axillary nerve, the radial nerve, the ulnar nerve, the median nerve, and the musculocutaneous nerve, okay? So you're gonna learn those 5. They all come from the brachial plexus. There are 3 what are called chords. So when these things come out here, they get sorted into divisions and chords. And there's a lateral chord, a medial chord, and a posterior chord. And you can see all 3 of those on here. There's only so much I can ask you to squeeze into your brain, so I'm not going to ask you to learn which nerve comes from which chord. Ordinarily I would do that, but you don't have to. But I do want you to know the peripheral nerves that come out of the brachial plexus. Okay? Of those 5, only 3 go down to the hand. Okay? Radial nerve comes around the back of the thumb. Ulnar nerve comes in on this side and innervates the pinky finger and half of the ring finger. And then the median nerve innervates everything else. Okay? The median nerve runs right through the carpal tunnel. So that's the nerve that gets impinged in carpal tunnel syndrome. Okay? You ever hear the term excruciating?
Yes.
You know what that means?
Very
Ever
painful.
been in excruciating pain?
Yeah.
You know where the term comes from? It's fascinating when I read this. Tricky Romans. They're so clever. Well, they figured out that if you drove a nail through the median nerve, then it hurt a lot. In fact, it hurt so bad that they invented a term for it. Excruciating. That's what happens when you get crucified. Okay? They put a nail through there and it crushes that nerve, and it's such a unique kind of pain that they gave it its own name. And here we are thousands of years later using the term excruciating with no idea what it means. Okay? What it means, the type of pain you get when you drive a spike through the median nerve. That's how bad that hurts. Okay? So there you go. Now you're not going to forget that one, right? That's the median nerve. All right. Brachial plexus. Then you get to the thoracic nerves, of which there are 12. It's not a plexus. They don't assort fibers. As they come out, they go along the intervertebral space where the intercostal muscles are, and they control the intercostal muscles that help you breathe, and they do cutaneous innervation, but they don't form a plexus. So the thoracic spinal nerves just go to the thoracic intercostal nerves, and they don't form a plexus. Then you get down to the lumbar region. I'm trying to remember. L1 through L4, I think, is the lumbar plexus. I think I gave you 2 important nerves from the lumbar plexus, the lateral femoral cutaneous and obturator?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So you can see those over here, lateral femoral cutaneous and the obturator are labeled. Then you go down into the sacral plexus, which is, depending on whose book you look at, L4 through S4. And one major one, well, there's actually 2. There's the femoral nerve, and then there's the the sciatic nerve, the sciatic nerve. So the sciatic nerve, you've probably heard of sciatica, right? So a few things
Yes.
about the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve is the longest peripheral nerve in the human body. It's the biggest and the longest. And you can see it on this model. If you look back here, you may or may not remember learning these muscles. But this big muscle up here is the piriformis, and then you got the superior gemellus, and obturator, and inferior gemellus. And that white ribbon that comes out between the superior gemellus and the piriformis is the sciatic nerve. And it passes through the posterior part of the ilium in that greater sciatic notch. And it comes out between these muscles and it goes down the back of the leg and it splits into the common fibular. Get the term right. Common tibial, which then splits into the anterior tibial and the peroneal, which is the fibular. Those are both nerves that act below the knee. So it comes down along the back of the leg, gets to the knee, and it splits to a tibial and a fibular, which goes lateral. Okay. So your foot muscles, the muscles of walking, your calf muscles, and the things that curl up your toes and stuff like that, are all part of that sciatic nerve. Sciatica is impingement on this nerve. And why is that such a common problem? Because this is a big nerve that comes out of the sacral plexus, which sits right at the base of the lumbar part of the spine. So if you're going to have disc problems or degenerating vertebrae and things like that, it's going to happen in this area. And the way it manifests is weird. You know, you'll get numbness, maybe a little bit of poor muscle control. But what you'll get is you'll get dysesthesia, where you'll start to feel odd sensations like itching and scratching and water running and stuff like that. I didn't know this was happening to me. This was back before I taught anatomy, but I would go jogging and I'd have to stop once in a while because I thought I had peed myself because I felt like water was running down the front of my leg. And I sweat a lot, so initially I thought that's what it was. And I wasn't sweating. I thought, what is that? You know, and it wasn't until years later I figured it out. Okay, I was developing sciatica. And what was happening is on my lower leg, the anterior part is innervated by the tibial nerve, and the posterior and lateral part is innervated by the fibular nerve, which are parts of the sciatic nerve. It was being compressed and damaged, and so my brain wasn't interpreting the action potentials properly, and my brain was making something up for that sensation. And to me, it felt like water trickling down the front of my leg. It went right down the front of my shin. There was nothing there. It was purely kind of a phantom type pain, and that was an indication of a peripheral neuropathy. It hasn't gotten a whole lot worse since then. That was 20 years ago, but that was pretty funky. And then you can imagine years later when I'm teaching this, I'm like, oh, that's what that was. Okay, you know, so it's kind of neat. The most common issue with lower back pain, hip pain, cramping in the legs, stuff like that is some version of sciatica. Okay, so you're almost certainly going to get some kind of question about that. So you're definitely going to want to be able to identify that sciatic nerve. Okay. Other than that, the quadriceps and the hamstrings, most of those are activated by the deep femoral nerve, which is another branch from the sacral plexus. Okay. That, in a nutshell, is what I want you to know about peripheral nerves. Okay. And all of that information is in the packet. So all you really got to do in your remaining 10, 15 minutes is just make sure you come and snap a few pictures of these models, these two in particular, plus this guy. Those are the three that you're going to ask questions on. Okay. I have the arm muscle sitting down here because every once in a while I put this out as a bonus to ask you to identify some of those 5 brachial plexus nerves. Okay. The axillary is way up here. The musculocutaneous innervates the bicep, so it's an anterior compartment, and the other 3 go down through the wrist. So you can see them on here. If you want to learn them on there, that's oftentimes a bonus question. Any questions?